Hello everyone and welcome back to ThursDev. I'm your host Luke and it's Horror Month. We're exploring the horrific and macabre this October, and this week I'd like to delve into a bit of a follow-up topic from last week's episode where we talked about improving how we handle player character death in our games. If you didn't join us for last week's episode, one of the biggest takeaways to oversimplify is that in a video game where death skews towards being a simple loss state, it's hard to evoke a powerful, visceral reaction beyond the first few times that you kill a player. For some who are good at suspending disbelief, the threat of dying alone is enough to keep some players playing carefully, but dying in a game, perhaps counterintuitively, is more of an annoyance than something to be feared. Last time around, we explored how we can give death more gravity through reward structures, making death more interesting for those times when a player must die, by introducing consequences, but I don't know that we've really solved death just yet. We've dug a little bit into how we can make that end state more valuable, how to get players invested in our death mechanics, but we still want our players to be fearful of death, and not just to get a reward or not to feel punished. So, in order to make death truly scary, is there some other way that we can create a sense of urgency, dread, and hesitation in our players that will deter them from simply charging forth and taking the deaths in a repetitive cycle of trial and error? Is there a way that we can make death impactful without needing to invoke those consequences? I have a thought, if you'll indulge me, that the way to really make death impactful is not to beat our players over the head with it, as it were, but to create scarcity. The more often the player dies, the more mundane death becomes, and that's the last thing that we want. We want the player to feel a sense of terror associated with death, and, as we know, terror is most easily created with anticipation and a lack of foreknowledge. As game designers, we want to make our players fear death by avoiding killing them. Give them a series of near-death experiences, maybe even cause a little pain and suffering, but make death a real consequence of carelessness and hand it out sparingly, and make it powerful when you do. So what do I mean by avoid killing our players? At the risk of sounding a little bit psychopathic, we want a really terrifying game to be like self-inflicted psychological torture to our players. We want to cause them to suffer while they play, but we want them to continue suffering, keep them at the brink, but never over the edge. We accomplish this by giving every possible opportunity not to die, and only killing them if they don't take the opportunities that are given to them. Because if the player knows that they can avoid death by being careful, that forms a habit of being careful, and even if the fear reaction isn't immediately associated with the act, habits are powerful things. Eventually, they're bound to start feeling uncomfortable getting out of the comfort zones that we provide them, and that gives us the opportunity to start removing their avenues of safety. Let's look at a personal favorite horror game that I feel does this almost perfectly. I invoked it in last year's video on creating terror in your games, so it should come as no surprise that it would be a perfect example of how we reinforce the fear of death: Alien Isolation. In Alien Isolation, from practically the moment that you set foot on Sevastopol, you are in a state of high alert. You spend somewhere in the range of the first 30 minutes or more of the game never really truly in any danger, so long as you're following the directions the game gives you, but still with the constant threat of personal harm looming over the player's head. The first major challenge, where the player is in real danger, doesn't come until the player is in a room of frightened people with guns, forced to use the same stealth that they've been taught up to that point to avoid them. As long as the player doesn't try to engage or move into the line of sight of the people, they're relatively safe. Not dissimilar to the eponymous Alien, even after it makes its first appearance, the player is shown from the moment it arrives that hiding means some degree of safety. Don't let it see you, be cautious, and it won't kill you. Run or make yourself obvious, and it will kill you before you have a chance to react. Despite the tension and constantly mounting terror of Alien Isolation, the player is relatively safe through most of the game. But they don't feel safe, and that's the trick of the game and why it's so effective. Not dissimilar to the oeuvre of frictional games Penumbra, Amnesia, and Soma, where there's death around every corner, but it somehow is able to be evaded as long as the player is vigilant. Like with horror films, the most tense moments are the ones where you fear the character is about to die. The beauty of a video game being that you can make it easy to die, but also keep death at arm's length. Show the murderer crossing the player's path but not noticing them, or telegraph danger to the player as with the radio static in Silent Hill series, or the howling of Half-Life 2's fast zombies in the distance in Ravenholm. Make no mistake, this is smoke and mirrors. We want to avoid killing the player as much as possible. It's easy to kill them, but deaths become cheap when they're in great supply. Though it sounds like it should be at cross purposes, by keeping our player alive, as long as the proverbial strings aren't showing, we can ration out death and near-death experiences in our games. It probably even behooves us to make our AI more likely to make a mistake when stalking our players here and there so that the player can escape and reflect upon how not doing as they were taught was a mistake, and further reinforcing the behaviors that we prefer. The best way to train your players to dread death is to dangle it in front of them in this way and tell them that death is easily avoidable, but will require you to always be aware that it could come at any moment. No respite, but no cheap deaths either. If you can make your players want to do everything in their power to avoid dying by teaching them to avoid it at all costs early on and reinforcing those habits, but giving them less and less opportunity, you'll successfully make death something to fear in your game. And that's all that I have for today. I hope that you enjoyed this special Horror Month edition of ThursDev and that you'll consider joining me again next week as the festivities continue. Until then, however, watch out for the Gru and take care.